Good afternoon, Joseph. We're here with Josef Brinkman of Traditional Medicinals to talk about a sustainable herbal supply chain. And Joseph, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting people in the world. I always come away with some new insight after talking to him, whether it be sustainability, historical tidbits, or a new point of view. How have you been?
Doing good. Nice to see you, Wilson, after 18 or 20 months of lockdown.
Yes, yes, it's great to see you too. As before we started recording this, I was telling you that just seeing you put this warm fuzzy feeling in me, just because it's great to see a, a friend that you haven't seen in so long. So,
Likewise, good to see you.
um, so at the recent American Herbal Products Association's Botanical Congress, there was a panel on the sustainable herbal supply chain, and some of the panelists had, the panelists had multiple definitions of sustainability, and some which included the human element, the people actually in the supply chain. Just at a very high level, like what would you consider like the components of a sustainable herbal supply chain?
Well, of course, it has to be nuanced and it depends on the size of the operation. And for example, if your brand is using 100 tons a year of an ingredient that needs to be imported, the definition may be different than if you need 100 kilos a year of something that you can grow or gather near where you're operating. So there are some vertically integrated brands in the states that have their own farms. Their definition will be different than a brand that needs to import significant quantities of something from different parts of the world. So yes, I do look at sustainability, including the social and economic criteria along with environmental. You have to factor in the personal relationships, continuity. Do the operations and country of origin have a succession plan? What standards are they following? What is the governance in the country they're in? Is there good governance over wild areas, for example, if you're talking about wild collection, or is there corruption in the government making it difficult to have managed resource management in wild areas? But basically, what I've been looking at since the late 90s are all of the emerging voluntary sustainability standards and looking at what criteria they look at. Initially, some were satisfied with organic certification and looking at the rules for that, whether it's farmed or wild crop. And early 2000s, I became dissatisfied with that limitation and realized, at least in my experience, that I needed to look at economic and social criteria as well. So I take a holistic approach and a whole ecosystem approach. While a certified organic farm, while it's conceivable that a farm could be certified organic, monocropping hundreds of hectares of the same crop, in my view, that's not really organic. It might comply with the regulations. There are criteria that organic farms are supposed to follow with regard to maintaining the biodiversity in the farm and leaving certain areas wild in the perimeter and all of that, and having habitat for pollinators and other creatures. But in practice, if you've seen a few big organic farms, it's not necessarily always the case. So for me, a big part is whether the operation, whether it's a farm or a wild collection operation, is not causing detriment to the ecosystem where they operate in. And the social and economic part is folks need to be making a livelihood. They need to be making a dignified income, livelihood, for being stewards either of a sustainable farm operation or a sustainable wild collection operation. Without making a reasonable income for doing it, it's difficult to expect rural folks to do all the hard work of implementing these rigorous sustainability standards and suffering the costs of time and money of audits and compliance. So, long story short, I think that brands, the way I look at it, a brand needs to have a visible, traceable supply chain for a sustainable supply chain that takes into consideration not just quality, like implementing GACPs, but voluntary sustainability standards and good relationships at every step of the way, from the meadow, the forest, the field, all the way through. It's not easy, but that's how I would define it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's definitely not easy, and I love the fact that you brought up the the point that it's not a one size fit all solution. Like, your local producer that might be able to wildcraft, 50 pounds to make, or even less to make a tincture to serve their local community is very different than a huge operation. And just because you meet the minimum standards doesn't mean that it makes you sustainable. It can make you organic but not sustainable, and vice versa. And it's a total ecosystem approach, and it's so true. And I think, one of the things that I really got to know you over is learning about Fair Wild from you at BioFoc over the years, and that in how it has that social economic component in addition to the sustainability component of it, and doing the proper work to ensure that the wild collection practices are done in a way that is minimizes the harm to the local environment while you're taking resources from that area. So I think, that's, you know so well said. It's just, I think a lot of people forget that this is not a one size fit all solution, and that's great. And just a FYI, Joseph, we are going to go through a Fair Wild audit for Northern Cassandra this August. So
That's
hopefully I'll
awesome.
have more to say about that. But thanks for putting me on it and lighting a fire under me to try to get it done.
Yeah, well, for environmental sustainability standards, the Fair Wild standard, even though the word fair is in the title, it's a far more rigorous environmental or ecological sustainability standard than organic wild is. And that's really how I got involved with it, because the criteria and the guidelines for the organic wild crop harvesting practice standard were minimal and fairly weak. Over time, the control bodies have come up with their own criteria for doing audits, and it's gotten better. But the Fair Wild standard is rigorous, and it has tools. Whether you go for certification or not, it has some of the best tools out there for carrying out risk assessment on the species level and resource assessment at the site-specific level, that also contribute to quality. Site selection is really important, just as it is with organic wild. But I have seen some Fair Wild operations in different countries that have given careful thought to the areas that they go to the government for to get, for example, a 50-year exclusive lease to a very remote area that has low possibility of contamination or pollution from unknown sources, and also low possibility that others will enter the area. Therefore, it's easier to implement a plan where only a known number of people have limited access to the controlled wild collection area. About the earlier point, though, of large quantities, there was an article that I contributed last year to the Journal of Medicinal Plant Conservation, United Plant Savers Journal, that was done together with the IUCN working group, and I wrote about our licorice supply chain in there. And that's a case where the company I'm with, Traditional Medicinals, uses a significant amount of wild licorice, and most licorice in global commerce is wild, although more and more is being cultivated. But that's a case where we spend a good amount of time looking for producers interested to implement these difficult standards. Licorice occurs in very remote places in the world. well, remote, I'm in California, so if you live there, if you live where it is, you're not remote, you're there. But in any case, if you're in California, if all your licorice comes from places like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and China, and then all the way to the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, where a lot of licorice comes from, it's far away from here, and it's difficult to have the visibility to what's happening on the ground. We spent a long time working on that. And the other part of sustainability that can be a complicating factor if you're working for a bigger company is the business need. It's a smart need to spread risk.
Mm-hmm.
You as you get bigger, you can't be single sourced. You can't rely on a single producer group. Anything can happen, and these are things I've seen happen. The owner of the operation suddenly dies, and there's no succession plan. The business is gone. What? The next order's not coming. There's a revolution in the country. There was no revolution last month, but there's a revolution this month, and all trade is disrupted. Oh, there's a 500-year flood. Oh, it happened 2 years in a row. You can't get into the collection areas. So these things are happening with more and more frequency, which really necessitates for a bigger company to have at least two, if not three, distinct producer groups for each important item that you balance your contracts against and keep all of them engaged with a certain amount of the business. And in the case of something like licorice, we may add a fourth. Well, we have four now. We get some from China that is actually processed into an extract, but our licorice is coming mainly from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Georgia. And most of the licorice in global trade these days comes from republics of the former Soviet Union, like the three aforementioned countries, as well as Afghanistan and Pakistan. And these countries, these newly established republics, have only been countries for 20 years, and before that they were in the Soviet Union. And there's still a lot to sort out, and there's still it's not always easy for American companies to have the access you need. But we've been able to work with really good producer groups in these countries. But you are also a bit vulnerable. When I was in Georgia last time and I asked the licorice collectors there, what do they worry about? On the list was the Russians invading Georgia again.
Mm-hmm.
So these are real situations, and some of the places the worries are the weather. Licorice is wild collected in floodplains, and some years the floodwaters don't recede quickly enough to get into the area to be able to dig roots. So I'm going on and on here, but it's important in the context of sustainable resource management to also spread risk and have really good relationships, not only with if you're importing and you're a brand, you're likely working with an intermediate company that is processing ingredients for you rather than procuring directly from small producer groups that might be cooperatives or small brigades of 10 or 12 people in a faraway country. You're likely working with an intermediary company who has the relationship. But I would maintain it's really, really important to know everybody in the value chain, and then you can work things out as they happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. You got to diversify your risks by having multiple suppliers, especially, there's geopolitical risks. And then right now we're seeing, in California, even where we're located, we're seeing a lot of extreme weather patterns and other environmental conditions associated with climate change. And we're sort of seeing, like you said, the impact of that on the supply chain and availability of ingredients, quantities of ingredients. So you're seeing this throughout the world, and it's
Did you
really
see the Chinese news today? The flooding in Henan province.
yes,
Oh my!
yep. It's we have flooding in Yunnan province, we have flooding in Germany and Belgium.
Yep.
It's you know I think global these extreme weather pattern changes are going to impact everywhere around the world. This is not no longer there's that incident over there, right? Wherever over there is, it could be here or there, but
Right. So that's important for long-term planning. As the science evolves, there's more and more papers being published on plants' ability to adapt to changing climates and whether plants in the wild are migrating, whether they can survive. So these climate change predictive models are important if you have a long-term relationship where you have to plan with a producer group. This is particularly important with plants that require many years plant maturity before you can harvest. So roots that might require 5-6 years, or tree barks that might be minimum 8 to 10 years, where you have to be looking ahead many years for your supply. But if the climate change predictive models say this plant is not going to be able to be grown in this area 50 years from now, then it's important to look ahead with the families or the communities that you're working with to find out what will grow where you are if you can't grow this anymore. For continuity of trade relationships, it's really complicated, but we unfortunately have to think about these things. Some plants are moving higher in altitude and encroaching the species that didn't have competitors before at higher altitudes. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's almost like they're invasive species now, as they move up altitude or down altitude, or through longitude or latitude, depending on the situation. I think one of the things that we're seeing is how do we support our local producers? How does New Herbs support them as weather changes, so that we can, like you said, if they're doing this now, can we get them to do something else? Start thinking about doing something else, because the traditional crop may no longer be suitable for that. And along with that, what whole different topic than sustainability is the chemistry of these plants also change slightly, as in some cases more than slightly, as the regions they're grown in and the altitudes they're grown in and the conditions change. It also changes the chemistry of the plant in a way that it may not perfectly match up to what it traditionally looked like.
Yeah, that's such a disturbing thought, but I have thought about it because your traditional use, your thousands of years of observation of safety and efficacy of a certain herb, and of course in the traditional Chinese medicine theory or concept of Dao Di, of geo-authentic, there's a reason that certain regions were preferred based on clinical observation of efficacy. And when the material comes from another area, right, the chemistry composition may be different and the therapeutic or clinical outcomes could be different. So it has to be monitored. Hopefully it's not significant, but it could be. We certainly know that wild plants that have been domesticated outside of their native habitat and then have escaped or naturalized, different ecochemotypes develop, the chemistry is different. Might still be a good medicine, but you have to do the science to determine if it can be used in the same way, at the same dosage as the geo-authentic material that is described in the traditional medicine literature. That's fascinating, but yeah.
whole different topic. And sort of to return back to the topic of sustainability and the herbal supply chain, just wanted to ask you one last question. Do you think companies just need to start building bigger inventories, maybe even across seasons and years, to prepare for these extreme weather events or geopolitical events, especially as you get bigger, right? You may not be able to always satisfy your needs, from that particular year if something happens. What's
Yeah.
your thoughts on the idea of maybe stocking a little bit, more material to sort of help smooth out your supply chain, in addition to having multiple producers, because maybe all the stands have bad weather that year.
Yeah, exactly. It's difficult. It depends on the available cash of the company to hold more inventory in the space, their warehousing space, and the stability of the botanical. We look at that, and you don't. if you can hold a raw material in a dried, relatively unprocessed form, not cut it too small. If it's an herb that's efficacy is dependent, for example, on its essential oil content, it's complicated. Really light flowers that are light flowers and leaves dependent on their essential oil content. Companies don't generally want to buy beyond the most recent harvest, depending on the form it's stored in and the storage conditions, and whether you have a controlled environment and tightly closed containers. Because if you are using materials where it needs to stay in specification for your entire shelf life of your product, then you have to add on the year or year and a half in warehouse, or 2 years in warehouse, to that, and do stability studies longer than that to see if it'll still be in specification. This is much easier, with plants that have more stable chemicals. It's more complicated in things like chamomile or peppermint, but it's easier with a lot of roots. But even some roots, valerian root is also dependent to a certain extent on essential oil content, and some herbs like that. The European Pharmacopoeia has a limit for whole dried valerian, and for cut dried valerian, the essential oil content drops by 25%, assuming a loss of a quarter of the oil content just by particle size reduction. Mm-hmm. So, yes, what some companies do, ingredient suppliers like yours, I'm not saying your company does this, but some ingredient suppliers, if they have rolling over contracts with the brands and they know roughly what the annual amount is and they have enough experience with occasional spikes, they'll come up with a buffer that generally works. In other words, if you generally need 10 tons a year, some years it's 9, some years it's 11, maybe they'll hold 11 to 12, and they have other customers for the same quality, so they won't be stuck with it at the end of the year as a new crop is coming in. You can work that out. You're right, it's smart. If you can do it, it's smart. If you can afford it, you have the space, and you have a good supplier who will work with you on it, it's a smart idea, because there's just too many uncertainties, from whether you can even book a container, if you can book the container, how long it'll take to get here. And this is the sort of thinking people in our industry have been thinking like this really since 2001 with the Bioterrorism Act. I don't know if you recall back then, but after that was passed, 2001, 2002, there were such significant delays at the port that we added I think at that time we added 90 days lead time to everything coming in due to the uncertainties at the ports. And then even with that, you have uncertainties, as you know, of whether FDA or USDA or Customs and Border Patrol will put an intensive hold on your container while they look at things, and who knows how long it's there. So, you got to still add several months up front due to those uncertainties. And, of course, the current situation during COVID, the difficulty to even get containers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you. You have to work with an experienced provider to know which ingredients can be, be multi-yeared or even longer than that season, right? Some things aren't very suitable for that, and other things are very suitable. And I think the key really is, like you said, is that you want to work with somebody that can help you build a buffer. And even if you run a little bit over, you can also account for increases in sales and delays at port or origin or any other things that may happen, any number of things that may happen. So whenever we work with anyone, we really want to understand their situation, how accurate their numbers are, and really, counsel, don't try to go, when you do look at your forecast, don't look at harvest to harvest. Look at, 2-3 months after harvest, right, is what you really counsel at New Herbs, our partners, to look at, because just because it's harvested at origin doesn't mean it gets processed, shipped, and arrives, the next day, right? It takes time.
And you got to think farther ahead. So in our experience, if we know something is a 3-year root crop or a 4-year root crop, we're being reminded each year how much how much more should the farmers plant? Should they plant the same amount for harvest 3 years from now? Because the fact is, and here I'm talking about some hard lessons many companies in the States learned in 2020 when there were spikes in demand for any products that had immune modulator ingredients in it. If you have a root, and even if you have a long-term relationship with farmers, they need to know each year what quantity you think you need 3 years from now. If it's something like that, if it's rhodiola, it's 6 years. If it's echinacea, it's 3 years. You have to give them a good indication, because it's not sustainable to cause a farmer to take all the risk. You have to make some commitments. Say, yes, we want you to plant another hectare because we see our growth rate like this. And in 3 years from now, if you don't do that, when you go back to your suppliers, they're going to say, well, you didn't plan 3 years ahead. There's no carryover stock. Nobody speculated on producing 50% more than you thought you needed. So, I think these days, I recommend that it gets easier the longer a company's been in business. But let's say you've been in business a couple of decades. You have a couple decades of sales data on your products and formulas. You should be able to work with a statistician to have a pretty good forward model of what you might need based on the past and based on trends. And you have to give your best guess to your supplier, who then probably transfers that to the farmer with what needs to be planned for. If you're thinking year to year, harvest to harvest, you're going to lose. You're not going to get everything you need.
Yeah.
Because this is a niche. Medicinal plants, it's not corn and sugar. This is a strange subgroup of plants, and farmers and wild collectors don't necessarily speculate. Oh, let's harvest 50 tons more than or produce 50 tons more than we have commitments for, and just see if we can sell it. That doesn't happen that much. Usually, when I talk to farmers, 80 to 90% of their crop is pre-committed, and the rest is for the buffer for their good customers and to account for any spikes. So, you need to plan ahead.
Thank you so much for your time, Joseph. I think the thing I heard about is planning, and make sure you have good partnerships and plan some more. And there's a lot of unknowns out there. So I really appreciate your time and your knowledge, and it's always great to talk to you.
All right, Wilson. Thanks for having me. Bye.